Okay, hope everybody is back and start the car. Right, so on property funds, there's a bit of a diagram we went into in the just before we went into the break. This is how the fund structure works, right? So, for example, you will have a real estate investment company, and they will have investments in properties, property 1, 2, 3, 4, and likewise. Now, if you, as the investor yourself, if you had tried to invest in the property directly over here, the cost would have been extremely high for you, right? And whether you can gear yourself to that extent is another question, right? So you have the real estate investment company here who has this portfolio of investments. And what happens, the investor is he purchases shares of the real estate investment company. Here, the quantum of investment which we have to make in terms of the real estate invest company's shares is much, much less. But at the same time, gaining exposure to property investment with a much lesser quantum of investment. Similar structure exists in the next slide as well, where it has a situation where the real estate fund or the real estate company, they have different funds, fund 1 and fund 2. And each of these funds, fund 1 will have, let's say, for example, 3 categories, and fund 2 will have 3 residential properties. The investor wants to, for example, have exposure to commercial property that the fund is going to be investing in. Investor wants to have exposure to residential property. He will buy the share, the units, or purchase the shares of the respective funds. Rather than having to invest in the property himself, which could be a very exhaustive exercise because of the quantum of investment required, as well as the other reasons we discussed. Now, with a much smaller investment, he can get access to the respective property investments. So that's how the property fund. Applicable to the fund structure. What do you mean by closed-ended funds? Just check something. Closed-ended funds, right? Here, the number of shares of the respective funds is a finite number, specific number, right? And generally, it will be issued through an investment company. Right? Now, this has major bearings on how it operates. So they will flow. Bear with me, guys. It's acting again. So the floated shares through an IPO, for example, can be pushed across to the capital markets, right? And of course, after the IPO, the initial public offering, the respective shares will be available on a listed exchange. Right? Now, investors will be able to purchase the shares not through the company; they'll be able to purchase the shares through the exchange, right? The stock exchange, for example. And if you are purchasing shares through an exchange, you will do that through a brokering firm or a brokerage firm in the secondary market. Right? Remember when we were talking about the financial markets we discussed, you have the stock exchange on the top. You have the members of the stock exchange, which are the brokering houses in the middle. And then you have the investors. Investors can't go and purchase shares directly off the exchange. Can you or me go and buy shares of the Colombo Stock Exchange? No. We have to go through a broker which allows us to purchase through the stock exchange. So with respect to the closed-end funds which are listed on a recognized exchange, if we want exposure to the respective fund, we will have to purchase or sell through the exchange, which is basically through a broker. And the price will of course reflect the market price which it is traded on the respective exchange. The open-ended funds on the other hand, right? The distinction is in this number of shares. If you look at it across over here, when we looked at closed-end funds, you have a fixed number of shares. Whereas when you look at the open-ended funds, this is over here, you have an unlimited amount of shares. This is what we mean by open-ended funds, right? Let's say you have an investor who wants to buy new shares in the company, in the fund rather, right? The fund can issue new shares to this new investor who wants to purchase shares in the fund, right? So I would have, look at the closed-end fund. I had 1 million shares. I floated it across through an IPO, and investors who want the exposure to the fund will have to buy and sell the 1 million shares in the market. That's it. You look at an open-ended fund, I have 1 million shares, but if a new investor is going to buy another, let's say 100,000 shares, I can issue a fresh set of shares for him, open-ended funds. Which basically means for an open-ended fund, you can grow pretty much unlimitedly if you actually look at it. Whereas the closed-ended fund, you only have a specific amount of shares. Traded at times which are dictated by the fund managers, right? Not necessarily open-ended. Prices for open-ended funds are fixed once a day at their net asset value. So net asset value is what? Total assets minus total liabilities equals the net asset value, which we like to call the underlying value, right? So this net asset value essentially reflects the fund's underlying performance. Only price at which you can purchase during the day, that underlying value. It's open-ended and closed-ended. The main distinction is on the shares, whether you can issue new shares and grow the fund or not. What are your standard varieties of real estate funds? Right. Number one is core funds. These are low risk, low return funds aimed at producing a return benchmark against an established property index, right? As we go along, we will identify this is like a passive investing approach. You have a fund, it replicates the performance of a particular property index and it will give you that return. That's it. No constant trading, no buy low, selling high at a crazy level. Not that much of activity going on. You have a property index, we will identify what is the composition. We'll see how to index later on. We will see what is the composition of that property index and we will try and replicate it in our fund. And we'll buy and hold, passive. Buy, hold, it will replicate the respective index. Co-fund approach. Low risk, low return as well, right? Similarly, the relationships will continue to remain. Then you have the core plus value-added funds. Uses a higher gearing and a more active management style to generate higher returns. Here, instead of only using the equity, we know, I mean, I'm sure you know as well how margin trading works, considering you're in a banking industry. The more leverage you use, why do we call it leverage? You can leverage your return upwards. In a market trending upwards, of course. Likewise, if you use gearing, the market trends downwards, your losses are also magnified to the same extent, right? Which you have to be careful about when it comes to leverage. How does the core plus value added funds operate? They use a higher level of gearing. And instead of taking an indexing approach, a passive approach, where you try and replicate the performance of an index, what happens here? You take a more active management. You buy, you sell, you buy, you sell. The level of activity, the number of transactions, the level of management is much more high compared to the core fund approach. And as a result of that, you are expected to earn a return which is much higher, right? But at the same time, you're using gearing, you're having a lot more trading, your transaction cost is going to be high, much more management, your administrative cost is going to be high. As a result of all these risks increasing, the return also needs to increase. Core plus value added funds. You have an opportunistic fund, right? All of this relates to property act, right? Typically closed ended, so you don't see new shares being issued. If you want an exposure to this opportunistic fund, you'll have to buy off the existing shares in the market. What does it do? Just as the name suggests, aims to exploit opportunities to acquire property from distressed sellers, redevelopments, and emerging markets. For example, currently, at least in the peak of the pandemic, which pretty much is the case now as well, Sri Lankan, there's a lot of foreign interest in Sri Lankan property market, right? Because pandemic and the continuous effect on it had some downturn, and some of the international property developers are actually long in our market, right? They are positive on our market. So it's an opportunistic investment, right? They are similar in nature to private equity funds. Why do they say they are similar in nature to private equity funds? This is because private equity funds are characterized by high risk, distressed seller, redevelopment, emerging market. Whether you can churn this investment into a profit still remains a question mark. But nevertheless, the investors are willing to make the respective investment, right? So, which is why they consider it as a similar to private equity investment, right? So, if you move from core funds, you move to core plus value added, and then you move to opportunistic fund, the level of risk keeps rising. Core funds, indexing approach, low risk, therefore low return. Core plus value added, we are going to introduce high level of debt, increased level of trading, high level of risk, high level of return. Opportunistic fund, level of risk is quite high. Therefore, the level of return should also be very high to compensate for the respective risk. Which brings us to real estate investment trusts, a very popular topic across the world. Sri Lanka is also trying to bring this in because it will bring a good level of diversification into our markets as well. Let's see how they operate. REITs is a company that owns and operates income producing real estate. Remember the structures I showed you? You had the company and it owns and operates income producing real estate, right? How does this work? It can either be commercial or residential property. And it differs from a quoted company that holds a portfolio of property. How? Because REITs are not liable to tax on any incomes or gain made on the property portfolio, right? That is classified, that is qualified by a particular statement though, which is coming soon, right? With any tax liability and instead distributes this income with any tax liability arising on the shareholder. Now, if I put that point down, yes. Now, certain countries, the law, they will, if you go and create a real estate investment trust, where you have a portfolio of managed property, income producing property portfolio, you can be entirely exempt from income taxes or other corporate tax, right? But it comes with a condition. At least 90% of your income has to be distributed to the investors. If you distribute at least 90% of your income, meaning the dividends, the payouts, then on a corporate tax perspective, the company has no liability. The only tax which will arise, therefore, will be when the investors receive the money, they will be liable for income tax, which is a different story. Right? So for real estate investment trusts, one of the characteristics is it is on a favorable tax footing, provided that it distributes most of its income out. REITs are traded on recognized exchanges. So the company which we were talking about, the structure which we looked at, it's got a set of income producing real estate investments, and the respective company is listed on a recognized exchange as well, which means there is continuous price availability. Think about the share market. At any given time, if you want to buy or sell a share, you know the price at which you can do so. Similarly, considering that real estate investment trusts are also listed on a recognized exchange, the same principle will apply. And therefore, you have liquidity as well. In direct property investing, if you were going to buy the property off the market, now if you wanted to liquidate your position in a hurry, this would have been difficult without incurring a significant discount. But if you get exposure to real estate through indirect investments, such as real estate investment trusts, which are listed on an exchange, here, due to its continuous price availability, you will easily be able to liquidate your position with minimal impact, right? Benefits of indirect property investment. REITs give investors access to professional property investment and provide new opportunities such as the ability to invest in commercial property. If you are an individual investor, right, and you are thinking about making a direct investment, there are certain competencies which you are going to lack, right? If you and I wanted to buy a property, in terms of the location, in terms of the dimensions, in terms of the structures, in terms of whatever it is, right? All these technicalities we might not have. Right? In terms of diversification, how can we think of the property from an investment perspective? There can still be certain variances, right? But if you go through a real estate investment trust, the company will possess the competencies to evaluate the respective portfolios. And me now indirectly investing in property through a real estate investment trust, I also automatically gain those advantages which the company also has, which I would not have had if I chose to go ahead with a direct real estate investment. There'll be new opportunities where they can take more level of gearing. There'll be more opportunities in terms of the quantum of investments which they can make, the specialization they have, the economies of scale they can have, the legal contacts which they might have, right? The ability to invest in commercial property. Can I go and put my money in a billion rupee commercial property? Definitely not. Can the company go and put its pooled funds in an investment in a commercial investment property of $1 billion? Yes. Whatever the exposure I want, I can get with the additional benefits of having access to professional management as well as the liquidity criteria, which the direct investment in property management didn't offer me. Removes a further risk of holding direct property investments, which is the liquidity risk, which I just mentioned. So factors that an advisor should consider when investing in real estate. Asset price bubbles. Property also can suddenly take off. I mean, just think about it. You're talking about sometimes in urban areas, you might want to spend about 12 to 20 million rupees on a perch, on a single perch, right? Is it a bubble? Is it cyclicality? What's the vulnerability there? You go and put your money at the peak of the real estate bubble, and once you hit the top, there's only one place to go, bottom. Imagine having advised your client to put your money at 20 million a perch, and then suddenly it's 12 million a perch. You've just lost him a massive proportion of his income, right, due to the depreciation. Very important to consider when you're going to put your money. Relative liquidity of property companies versus investment funds. Stock exchange listed funds are more liquid. This can change depending on the investor's requirement. If he has an extremely long investment horizon rather than a short investment horizon, he doesn't have any liquidity requirements in between, right? He has other sources of income, then he might have the capacity to go and put it in a direct real estate investment. Perfectly fine. Even if he requires any liquidity requirement through his current income, he can supplement. But you're talking an investor whose only portfolio you are going to put into a direct real estate investment. The rental income will not be adequate. Capital appreciation, he'll have to wait a long time before he can reap the benefits. In the event he has a liquidity requirement because he doesn't have any other source of significant income, you will have to liquidate it. And can you do it soon? No. There, it is not suitable. Permitted levels of gearing. Gearing levels can go up to 90% of property values, which can increase the risk of investment. Right? In other words, when you think about a mortgage loan, right? Provided you're giving a tangible, considering when it comes to property, you're giving a tangible asset, you can keep the asset itself as collateral and take a significant proportion of that property's value as a loan. But at the same time, the risk also increases, right? Charges, notice periods, redemptions, penalties, all the legal issues attached to the investment property can be taken into consideration there. Right, so we moved from cash, money markets and deposit at the lowest levels. We moved across onto bonds, which gives you a relatively high level of return. Still the risk is low, but there is some risk because of the default criteria coming into play. Then we went on to property, gives you a good return, good diversification benefits, has a few risks in terms of the liquidity criteria, which can be overcome through an indirect investing in real estate through the forms of REITs or otherwise. Right now, the risk return characteristics are increasing little by little. And now when we consider equities, we are probably at the highest level of risk which we are talking about. Everybody wants to put their money in the markets, particularly now, local context, right? October 2020, it was a frenzy out there up until about February 21. It was pretty crazy out there. I mean, I probably told you this, there were fixed income earners, the retirement guys who just liquidated their fixed income portfolios and put their monies into capital markets, right? But you need to realize capital markets, equities are at the highest level of risk which we are talking about. Why? Why in particular? There's a lot of volatility, price issues and all of that whatnot. Yes. But you look at the basics, right? You put your money in a deposit. You hold your money in a savings account, right? If at all the interest income will come down, you're not going to lose capital. You put your money in bonds, right? There may be certain fluctuations, but your interest is a guaranteed, and assuming no credit event, your principal is also literally guaranteed. Small risk increase there because of the credit risk. You put your money in property, rental income will come, capital appreciation will also come. You're backed by a tangible asset, right? Still you're in a good place. Liquidity and all is an issue. You put your money in capital markets. You put 100,000 rupees in capital markets, equities, whether you will get dividends is a question mark. Depends on the management, depends on the company status, depends on the economics. If the markets perform bad, you entered into the stock at, let's say, 10 rupees, suddenly the market, the overall market is bad, the economic sentiment is bad, the COVID-19 has a major issue, market takes a downturn. Suddenly your share price, the share price is only worth 5 rupees. You have lost 50% of your capital asset. This is the major issue with equities, which is why we consider it to be high risk. You can lose your capital. The volatilities are huge. The current income is a question mark, right? Major risk asset class. But at the same time, higher the risk, higher the return, right? Sometimes you put your money in at 10 rupees on the share, within a small space of time, it has shot up to 20 rupees on the share. I told you a good example. March 2020, 180 rupees Expolanca stock. October or November 2020, during that frenzy, it was touching about 60 rupees. Imagine you put 2 rupees, let's say for instance, on the stock, and suddenly each of the shares is worth 60 rupees. Yeah, multiply that by about 100,000. You would have, if you bought 100,000 shares, meaning you bought 200,000 at day one and you exited your position in October, November, you would have had 6 million rupees maybe in your hand. That's the level which we are talking about. High risk, high return. Let's jump into the characteristics. What are we trying to do? Understand the types of equity and equity related investments. Shares, ordinary shares, common shares, preference shares, ADRs, which is American Depository Receipts, or GDRs, which are Global Depository Receipts, warrants, covered warrants. These are what we are going to be talking about from an equity perspective. Historically, equities have generated superior returns compared to other asset classes. They should. Why? Higher the risk. You can't be giving the same risk as the other asset classes because they are relatively low risk, right? But at the same time, the volatility and risk attached to the same is also very high. You need to know how to play markets as well. You take the Sri Lankan market, for instance, you take a 20-year period and see, or maybe not 20 years, say 2012 or no. Yeah, 20-year period. You will see peak, trough, peak, trough, peak, trough. This is what is cycle. Sometimes the cycle is long, sometimes the cycle is short, but you will see it coming. So you will enter in at the lower point, exit at the higher point, enter in at the lower point, exit at the higher point. You keep churning, this will make profits. Right? Easier said than done. Right? But we need to realize this, because what I was trying to get at there is, if you, for example, had a buy and hold strategy there sometime, you bought into a stock, let's say in 2012, at 10 rupees, it went up to 14, it went up to 18, it went to 24, it came down to 14, it came down to 11, it went up to 14, it went up to 18, it came down to 10. It will go through the cycles. But think about the position. I held it for 5 years. I entered into the stock at 10 rupees. 5 years down the line, it's still 11 rupees, only 10% return across 5 years. I could have made so many profits at so many different points, right, in the cycle. I didn't. Buy and hold strategy didn't make sense there. Right? These are decisions which we will have to make with equities. Types of shares which you are going to be interacting with. Typically, these are categorized into either ordinary shares or preference shares, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but of course, we will look into it. The difference, how we distinguish between the type of shares, depends upon the income received and the voting rights that the respective shares carry. Ordinary shares, how do they work? Investors are subscribing to the risk capital of the company, meaning what? Whether you will get a dividend is a question mark. Whether there is a capital appreciation, there's a question mark. In the event of a liquidation, you're the last to get paid. Right? This is the highest risk situation in terms of the capital for the company. So you are subscribing to the risk capital of the company. Performance of the investment is closely linked to the company. If the company does well, their earnings are high, their net asset base is high, their cash flows are good, company share price is going to increase, the company's profitabilities, cash flows, etc. are going to increase, company's share price is going to increase, your investment is also going to perform. Likewise, sales are declining, profits are at risk, no cash flows. Now your share price is going to take a tumble. What is going to happen to your investment performance? Going to come down. Established with a nominal value generally, but in our case, Sri Lankan context, we don't have these par values, etc. Anymore. Right? At a point of time, yes. You also have common shares, which are basically ordinary shares themselves, identical to ordinary shares. They represent a proportionate ownership of the company, normally carry voting rights, and is also entitled to dividends and technically represents the risk capital of the company as well, right? So in every sense of the way, ordinary share. The principal difference is that they will not carry any nominal value. You can say the share is a 10 rupee nominal value trading at X amount of price, or the share is of 1 rupee value trading at X amount of price. That is not carried for common shares. Which brings us to the next category, preference shares. Just as the name suggests, preference shares, also known as preferred stock. These guys, if you invest in the preference shares of the company, you will have what we call a preferred claim on the assets earnings of the company compared to the common or the ordinary shareholders. Meaning, you will have first right to the interest. Preference shareholders get interest or preference dividends. You will have first right to the assets in the event of a liquidation. So before ordinary or common shareholders get paid a dividend, the preference shareholder has to get it. In the event of a liquidation, before the common or ordinary shareholders get their portion, preference shareholders get their portion, preferred above the ordinary or common shareholders. The preference extends to dividends and claims on assets prior to the ordinary or common shares. Preference shares, in a major distinction, is non-voting unless in exceptional circumstances, such as when the dividends have not been paid. Generally, preference shares do not carry any voting rights. You only have a preferred claim over the earnings and the assets of the company, and you don't carry any voting rights. But there are situations depending on how they have been issued. If, let's say, the company doesn't pay the dividend to the preference shareholders, depending on the structure of the issue, they will also suddenly get entitled to vote in relation to the activities of the company, because obviously their investment is at risk. Pay a fixed dividend each year. So interestingly, if you look at preference shares, they do have a fixed dividend each year. So this fixed dividend, a set amount, is similar to having a fixed income instrument on your balance sheet, right? Which is why sometimes when on a financial analysis basis, sometimes we take into consideration preference shares as debt instead of equity, and we calculate because of this characteristic of a fixed payment. Relatively less risk and therefore relatively lesser return. Does that make sense, guys? Take the ordinary and common shareholders, as I keep mentioning. Dividends is a question mark. Capital appreciation is a question mark. The last event of liquidation. Preference shareholders, dividends is fixed and given each year. Has preferred claim on the earnings and the assets of the company. In the event of the liquidation, gets paid before the equity holders, before the ordinary shares and the common shares. Relatively, who is more risky? Ordinary and common shares. Relatively, who is less risky? Preferred shares. So if preferred shares are relatively less risky, the return also should be relatively low. Same relationships continue. Considered as a hybrid security. This is the discussion we had a moment ago, as it has characteristics of both debt to equity. Why do we say that? It has the characteristics of debt because it has a fixed payment going on, similar to the interest payment on debt. It has the characteristic of equity because we consider it as part of the capital of the company, part of the equity of the company, not part of the debt. So one of those hybrid instruments. Most preference shares are cumulative in terms of dividends, meaning if in the current year I don't pay dividends to the preference shareholders, next year I have to pay the previous year's plus this year's dividends to the preference shareholders. Mostly, generally, cumulative dividends is what is associated with preference shares. There can be, in certain instances, non-cumulative preference shares as well. But it will be extremely difficult to mark non-cumulative preference shares, right? Other types of preference shares can include, for example, participatory preference shares. In addition to the fixed dividends, they are also entitled to company profits if the ordinary dividends exceed a specific level. So company declares a level of ordinary dividends to the ordinary shareholders. If it jumps a particular level, in addition to the fixed dividends that the preference shareholders receive, they will also be entitled to a particular portion of the company's profits as well. Redeemable preference shares. Redeeming meaning what? We are going to take it back to the company, redeeming to the company. The preference shares being issued with a predetermined redemption price and date, meaning it has a end date. I am issuing preference shares. You will get a fixed dividend. You cannot participate in the voting. In 3 years' time, I will buy it back from you, done and dusted, at a specific date. Price and date at which the preference shares are redeemed are already defined, predetermined. Some redeemable shares are issued as convertible preference shares as well. Meaning what happens at the end of 3 years, they get converted to some redeemable preference shares are get converted to convertible preference shares, which allowed to be converted into equity as well. And then you have the convertible preference shares itself, solely convertible preference shares. These are preference shares, as well as having the right to fixed dividends, can be converted into the ordinary shares at a pre-specified price or rate on predetermined dates. Let's say, for example, I have convertible shares in a particular company. The condition might be in 3 years' time, I will be able to convert the preference shares into equity at, let's say, 2 to 1. For every 2 preference shares, I'll get 1 equity or common share of the company. Now we were looking at redeemable preference shares. You can also have irredeemable preference shares. What do you mean by irredeemable preference shares? It doesn't have an end date. Interesting how you will deal with this. Right? Look at the instrument. Can't participate in the voting. You are given a fixed dividend every year. If it is irredeemable, it is going to have an indefinite life, irredeemable, right? So no fixed date for the shares to be repaid. Capital would normally be repaid for these irredeemable preference shares only when the company is being bound. And of course, since they are preference shares, they will continue to have the benefit, the preference above the common or ordinary shareholders as well. A few points to note there. Other types of shares, you can have ordinary shares, which may be referred to as partly paid or contributing shares. This means that only part of the nominal value has been paid up. For example, I issue 10 rupee shares. When I was doing A levels, I remember these calculations. I issue shares with the nominal value of 10 rupees, but I only call for 6 rupees of the share. I only call 6 rupees of the share. So you have a 10 rupee share for which you have only paid up 6 rupees, partly paid. Right? At a later date, I can call the remaining 4 rupees as well, partly paid or contributing shares. American and Global Depository Receipts, ADRs and GDRs, right? Again, remember lots of abbreviations which you will have to deal with. What is a depository receipt? Let's start there. It's a negotiable instrument, like a check, like a bond, etc. It's a negotiable instrument. What does it represent? Ownership interest in securities of a foreign issuer, typically trading outside its home market. So I have bought a negotiable instrument of a, so it's ownership interest of a foreign issuer who is trading outside his market. Let's just put it into context. You have a Singaporean company who has issued depository receipts. Me being in Sri Lanka, I have bought these depository receipts from, let's say, the Indian market, or let's say the UK market, to make it a little more formal, from the UK market. Singaporean company has issued the respective notes outside his home market, and I have bought these depository receipts. Ownership interest, foreign issuer trading outside its home market. Singapore, home market, trading in London Stock Exchange, bought by me. That's a depository receipt. Provides a cost-effective and simple way of investing in overseas companies. Take a Sri Lankan context. Can you buy shares in a foreign company, listed company? You can't randomly buy. You can't, right? Not allowed, particularly not these days for sure, right? You might have certain restrictions. Therefore, companies without the higher costs that are normally associated with owning foreign shares, right? So it is a cost-effective way. So that's a depository receipt. What are we talking about when it comes to an American depository receipt? This is, it's only going to be America rather than Singapore, and global other than America is what we're talking about. Right? American depository receipts involves buying the stocks of a foreign company in the issuer's home market and depositing the acquired shares in a depository bank in an overseas market. The bank issues the ADRs that are equal to the value of the shares deposited with the bank. So you have the Singapore sorry about that again, guys. So you have the American company, and you have an issuer who is going to buy the shares of the American company and go and deposit this in what we call a depository bank, which is in an overseas location. Depository bank issues the ADRs to any investor who wants to purchase to the value of the shares deposited with the bank. So American company, but shares have been issued and trading outside its home market, purchased by investors across the globe. Denominated in dollars, issued in bearer form. Bearer form is dangerous. Why? If you lose the certificate, if you lose the depository receipt, whoever bears it, whoever holds it, is going to be the ultimate owner. Depository bank is the registered shareholder, not you. They confer full shareholder rights, and the depository bank makes arrangement for issues such as the payment and dividends. So you have the company in the US, you have the depository bank outside the US market, and you have the investors. Depository bank is the registered shareholder. When the company in America pays the respective dividends, the depository bank takes the necessary action to pay the dividends to the respective investors. The process, right? Spend some time with this, with the curriculum. I will take you through it. The domestic company, already listed in its local exchange, America, sells its shares in bulk to a US bank to get itself listed on a US exchange. That's what the US company does. The US bank, we are still in one region. The US bank accepts the shares of the issuing company. The bank keeps the shares in its security and issues certificates. They are literally certificates, but the definition is American depository receipts. And they will issue it to interested parties through the respective exchange. The investors set the price based on demand and supply. The buying and selling in ADR shares by the investor is possible only after the US Stock Exchange lists the bank certificates for trading. Otherwise, you don't have a liquidity, you can't close out. It's regulated by the SEC, Stock Exchange Commission, keeps a check on necessary compliances that need to be complied by the foreign company. The depository receipt therefore gives the international investor simple and easy access channel of investing in international markets. Whichever the market you want to go across into, you can easily do that, right? So you have the, by domestic company, we mean the company outside the US. They are going to issue shares to a US bank. The US bank will float it in the US Stock Exchange and make the shares available to the respective investors. when the foreign company pays dividends, the US bank is made sure the dividends get to the respective investors. Who is the registered shareholder of the respective ADRs or the shares? It's going to be the depository bank. The custodian bank may issue depository receipts before the actual deposit of the underlying shares, which is called a pre-release of the ADRs. And trading may take place in this pre-release form as well, right? Before the shares have actually been deposited with the bank. Global depository receipts, GDRs, same structure, no difference. Only thing is the receipts are done in an international market. Previously, what was our example? American depository receipts, foreign company issuing the ADRs to a US bank, and US bank is going to float it in the exchange. Here, foreign company is issuing it to a foreign market except the US, with the exclusion of US. If it's in the US, it's American depository receipts. Anywhere else in the world, that same issuer is going and putting the money in the depositing the shares in a UK bank, depository bank, and they are floating it in the London Stock Exchange. It's a global depository receipts. They do the same thing in South Africa. They do the same thing in the Netherlands. Whatever they do, global depository receipts. Only if the structure takes place in America, we call it an American depository receipt. Still on equities, we look at warrants, which I'm sure you're familiar with if you've had some interaction with the stock market as well. It's a negotiable instrument, but what does it do? It's not a share. Warrants are not a share, right? Warrants provide the holder. If I go and buy a warrant of the market, let's say a John Keells warrant, John Keells holding warrant, I buy. What does this mean? Does it give me ownership in the company? No, it doesn't. Does it give me the right to vote? No. Does it give me a right to dividends? No. What it gives me is the right to purchase a number of ordinary shares at a specific price on or before a specific date. If I buy a, let's say 150 rupee John Keells holding warrant at 50 rupees today, and it allows me to purchase it at 100 rupees within a specific time, if I exercise the warrant at 100 rupees per share, now I am entitled to dividends and voting. If not, holding the warrant, no. Holding the warrant only gives me the right to purchase ordinary shares at a specified price on or before a specific date. The investor is not obliged to buy or sell. He can sell the warrant if he wants to even. But if he holds the warrant, he is not mandatory. It's not mandatory on the investor to exercise the warrant. It's an option. We'll talk about options and derivatives also. Therefore, the maximum loss for the investor will be limited to the initial investment. I bought the John Keells warrant at 50 rupees. But I don't want to exercise for whatever technical reason. And I allow the warrant to lapse. What is my maximum loss? 50 rupees. That's it. If the investor chooses to exercise, very important point, the company will issue additional equity shares. John Keells already has, for instance, 1 million shares, and they issue warrants. If I choose to exercise the warrant, it's not from the existing bunch of shares that I'm going to get. I am going to get from a fresh issue of shares is where I'm going to get the share from. Right? Important point. So after the warrants are exercised, the company's capitalization situation is going to be 1 million shares plus whatever was issued from the warrants being exercised. What do we know as a covered warrant? This is a securitized derivative issued by someone other than the company whose share it relates to, right? Someone other than the company. When it is issued, the issuer will generally buy the underlying asset of the market to deliver the asset if it is exercised. So at the same time that I am issuing the covered warrant, I'm also going to buy the share, right? So let's look at it like this. You have the John Keells shares, right? I'm a separate financial intermediary. I'm going to issue a covered warrant to someone. Now, am I associated with John Keells? No. Someone other than the company, right? I will issue covered warrants to you, allowing you to allowing you the right to purchase shares of John Keels. Now, if you exercise your warrant, your covered warrant, I need to have shares to deliver because John Keels is not related here, right? Therefore, to cover that obligation of mine, because if you choose to exercise, I am obliged to reciprocate. You have the right, I will be compelled to if you choose to exercise. To cover that obligation, I will buy shares of John Keels and hold it with. If and when you exercise, I will give you the shares which I hold. I will deliver the shares. Generally issued by a number of leading investment banks and can be based on stocks, indices, currencies, or commodities. Right? How much of equities do we have? Okay, so we have a bit of equities to go with. I think let's call it a day with warrants, guys. Right? So the floor is open for questions, guys. Any questions, guys? Don't forget once again, the question session will open on Saturday at 7 p.m. There was a question on why Saturday at 7 p.m. I'll just speak to the guys. That was not my call. It's quarantine after. I mean, it's restricted times, right? You can't go out. Otherwise, you will also appear in the news. Don't go for parties or anything. You can do the questions. But I'll see what they have to say. If there can be a window or something so that you won't be inconvenienced. That was not my fault. Any questions, guys? If you might have. So you move along with asset classes. Very good. Thinking in well and comprehension is good. If you got any questions as usual, since there's nothing over here at the moment, feel free to reach out LMS or your coordinators. We'll be glad to respond. I do it anyways. Have a good evening, and I shall catch up with you next week today. For sure.